If you love learning about Blender, then you will have probably seen tons of video tutorials on YouTube about how to create 3D models and realistic materials. But you will also know that there are many other things that Blender can do besides being able to create 3D models for scenes. Blender has its own sculpting package, as well as being able to edit videos and animations. So while I could have done a multi-part series on how to create a scene in Blender or how to create some realistic looking materials, I thought instead that we would focus on a topic that doesn't get anywhere near as much attention on YouTube, and that is being able to use Blender's Compositor to edit images and animations that have already been created. So welcome to this 6-part YouTube tutorial series on how to composite images and animations using Blender version 2.8. In this series, we're going to be focusing on the fundamentals of compositing. So how you can set up Blender to easily compare results between your original image and your composited image, how to perform basic color correction on your image, how to use things like filter nodes to create cool effects such as glare, and also how to isolate parts of your image and how to use render passes in Blender. All that and more is coming up in this 6-part series on how to composite images and animations in Blender version 2.8. Now, if you want to follow along with this 6-part series using your own projects, you are more than welcome to do so. However, if you are looking to use the project that we are using for this series, then you can download it via the link in the video description. But not only will you be getting all of the assets related to our project, if you sign up, you will also get access to our free Blender 2.8 PDF cheat sheet, full of keyboard shortcuts that are commonly used in Blender for things like navigating the 3D viewport, creating animations, manipulating nodes in the compositor, etc., as well as some of our top tips and tricks for making the most of your Blender experience and improving your workflow. On top of that, you will also have access to our bi-weekly newsletter for the latest information on all things related to Blender. Now, before we begin looking at all of the different things that we can do with compositing in Blender, just a quick note that this file is using Blender version 2.81. So if you are using your own project, just know that with this lecture in particular, there are going to be a couple of things that you won't be able to do if you are using Blender version 2.80. So the best thing is to make sure you are using Blender version 2.81 if you want to fully follow along with this tutorial. Now, what we have here is a default scene. So I'm just going to view our scene in the rendered viewport shading method. And we already are looking through our camera here. So we've got our camera shot set up. This is the image that we are looking to render. And all we're going to do first of all is we're just going to render an image. So over here in the properties panel, you can see that we are using our GPU for the render. We're using the Cycles render engine, which we will be doing throughout this tutorial series. And we've set the number of samples for the first render to 128. So what we're going to do now is we're going to render and select render image, and then we'll come straight back once this render has been completed. So with the image now rendered, we can close this window. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move over to the Compositing workspace. So left click where it says Compositing, and you should see something like this. Now, if you're using your own project, you might not see anything at all here. If that's the case, it's probably because your Use Nodes option up here is not ticked. So just make sure that that is ticked, and then these two nodes should appear. Now, normally you should be able to see an image here, but if you do not see that image, then simply left click and drag so that you detach the composite node from the render layers node, and then reattach and release. Now we should be able to see our rendered image. So this render layers node represents the image that we have just rendered in Blender. The composite node is the output here. So we can put different nodes in between these two nodes to make changes to our rendered image, and any changes that we make will be present in the composite node. Now down here we have a timeline, but we don't need the timeline, so we're actually going to be replacing this with two new panels. So I'm just going to increase the size of the timeline, then I'm going to right click and select vertical split. Then left click about here so that we have two panels, and we're going to change this one to the image editor, and we're also going to change this one to the image editor as well. Now at the moment both of these are showing the exact same image. This is our render result. And when we have our render result viewable in the Blender interface, any changes that we make by adding nodes here will become visible down here. So for example, if we add a new node, and I've just brought up that menu by holding down the Shift button and pressing A on my keyboard, that brings up our add menu. And let's go color correction, and we bring in this color correction node, and we're just going to drag it over this line. So left click, and it now attaches the color correction node to both the render layers node and the composite node. Now if we start to manipulate these values, you can see that the changes being made here are visible in both of these panels. Now this is not the exact layout that we want, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to delete the color correction node, and you can delete a node by making sure it is selected. So left click to make sure the appropriate node is selected, hit the X key to delete. Now when we do that, because these two are no longer attached, the image here becomes black because there's nothing to connect to the composite. So again, it's just a matter of taking the image output here and plugging it into the image input, and then we get our image back. Now rather than using the composite node to preview the final result, I prefer to use it to just preview the original image. So throughout this tutorial series, we're actually not going to be adding anything between our render layers node or our composite node. Instead, we're going to be adding a viewer node to this setup. So hit Shift A, go to Output and select Viewer. Now we're going to pop the viewer about here. You'll notice that we have this box that's shown up, and it's like that because we currently don't have anything attached to the viewer node. So let's take the image and plug it in here, and now you can see in the background that our rendered image has appeared. Now if you don't see this, then you'll want to left click where it says backdrop. So if I left click there, you can see it disappears. If I left click again, we can once again see the image. Now if I left click on the viewer node, we can then begin to manipulate this image. So we can manipulate its size by grabbing one of these handles and manipulating it from each of those respective handles. Or we could move this image entirely by holding down the Alt key, holding down the middle mouse button on our mouse, and then moving our mouse around, and this allows us to move the image itself. Now if we were to not use the Alt key but still use the middle mouse button, we'd be able to pan around our node setup instead. So the last thing I'm going to do here with regards to the setup is come down to this panel, and we're going to change this from the render result to the viewer node. So what we now have on display is a large version acting as the backdrop for our viewer. So this is going to be the final result. We have the render result itself located here, and we also have the viewer node located here. Now another way that we can view our result is by using a split viewer. So I'm just going to show you that very quickly. So we're going to hit Shift A, Output, and then go Split Viewer. Now I'm going to position it here and plug the output of the image into this top image node here. And at the moment we can't see anything, but that's because the viewer node here is the current active view. So we need to left click on Split Viewer in order to see it. And now you can see that we basically have one half of the image visible. To get the other half, we would need to again take the output of the image here and plug it in to here. And now we can see both sides. So this acts as another method of being able to preview the effects that specific nodes are going to have on your final result. So for example, let's add back in a color correction node, and I'm just going to hover it over the bottom one. So you'll see as you hover over one of these lines, they become highlighted. So once it does that, left click, and it should connect the node to the node tree. Now if I manipulate these values again, you should be able to see that this time only one half of this image is being altered. You can change where this dividing line is located on the image by manipulating the value of this factor. So if we increase it, you can see the line moves across here, and it will move in the opposite direction if we decrease the factor. You can also determine whether you want the split viewer to work in the X direction or the Y direction. Now for this tutorial series, I'm not going to be using the split viewer node. So we're just going to select the split viewer node, hold down the Shift key to allow us to select other nodes. So we can select the color correction node along with the split viewer node, and then hit the X key to delete both of those nodes. And now we're back to having our composite and viewer nodes. Next, we're going to demonstrate how we can save a new image that is separate from the original rendered image. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit Shift A, and this time we're going to add a blur node. So we're going to add some blur to this image. So left click to bring it into our editor, hover over this line and left click. Now at the moment nothing has changed on our image, and that's because we need to manipulate the X and Y values here. So I'm just going to set this to 3 and the Y to 3. And then we should begin to see a very subtle change. Now if we increase this, you can see that the blur gets much stronger. So what we're going to do is we're going to find a nice value for the blur. So we only want a little bit of blur, but we still want it to be noticeable. So let's use a value of 8 on each axis. And there we go. So it's a subtle change from the original image, but it is a noticeable one, so we have some blur in our image. Now, if we want to save this, there are a couple of places where we can save this result. We can either go to our viewer node here, go Image, and then select Save as Image to save as a new image. Or we can select the viewer node itself, and in the side panel here, we can click on Save this image. Now, if you don't see this side panel, so it looks something like this, you can press the N key to bring that side panel into view. So I'm going to click Save this image, and then I'm going to locate somewhere where I can save the image. So I have created a file where we're going to be saving our composited images. I'm just going to name this, and we're going to just call it blur, since that's the only change that has been made to this image. And you will notice that by default it should be a .png file. If it's something that you don't want to use, you can come up to where it says format and then change the type of file here, so you have things like JPEGs, PNGs, etc. So once you're ready to save, just click on Save this image, and now your composited image has been saved as a separate file. You can very easily do this with the composite node itself, so you actually don't need the viewer node here, but I like to use it because I like to have that distinction between the original image, which is viewable through the composite node, and also the altered image, which is used from the viewer node. You could even actually just reverse this entirely and then plug the blur into the composite and then save the composite node instead. So you can do that as well. But I like to use the viewer node for any alterations that I make to the image. So just plug that back in to the viewer node. Now, before we do anything else, I want to talk very quickly about render passes. So here in the render layers node here, we have three options: image, alpha and depth. These are known as passes, but you can also have many more of these. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how you can add these additional passes, and we're going to use a few of them to reduce the amount of noise in this image. Now, because we've used the blur node, there's not a lot of noise that's visible, but if we select a node and then hit the M key on our keyboard, we can mute the effect of that node. So here, if you have a look underneath the benches, you should be able to see that there's quite a bit of noise there, and there's also quite a bit of noise around the ball where it attaches to the cone. And actually it's better if I use the viewer node here for this. So if we zoom in, you can see that there's a lot of noise if you zoom up close. It's not as bad if you scroll out, but if you enlarge this image, you can really start to see how much noise there is in certain places, especially where there are shadows. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to the properties panel, and then if we go to our view layer properties, you will see that there is a subsection called passes. If it's closed, just open it up, and you will see that we have a variety of options here. Now, I'm not going to turn on every single one, but we are going to turn on most of these so that we can manipulate them in a couple of future tutorials. So I'm just going to make sure each of these are active, and you can see as I activate each of these in the properties panel, they become visible in the render layers node. So we'll turn those on. We're going to turn on the denoising data, which is going to be important for what we're about to do. And we also have the light passes. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn on the diffuse, the glossy, and the transmission options. We're not going to be using subsurface or volume because neither of these are present in this scene. Now to select them quickly, I can left click, hold down the left mouse button and just hover my mouse across each of these options to turn them on automatically. We also have some options here, so I'm going to turn on emission, shadow and ambient occlusion, and that should be more than enough for this series. So you can see now that the render layers node is very big. However, any nodes that we have added, any outputs that we have added to this list, if we were to plug them directly into the viewer node, so for example the ambient occlusion directly into the viewer node, we would see absolutely nothing. So what we have to do here is we have to re-render our image. So I'm just going to plug the blur back in here just for the moment. And now what we'll do is we will go to the layout workspace. Just give that a second to load up. And what I'm going to do actually is just change that to a different method of shading, just so we can do things a little bit quicker. And I am actually going to decrease the number of samples, not increase, I'm going to decrease the number of samples from 128 down to 25. And you're going to see why I do this in a couple of moments. So let's now go to render and render the image. And this should be much quicker than the previous render that we did earlier, because we have only 1/5 the number of samples that we had before. So we're just going to wait a few seconds for this to complete. And you can already see that there's a lot more noise in this image, but we're going to solve that with the help of compositing. So we're going to hit the X button here just to close this, and then go to the compositing workspace once again. And you can hopefully see that there is a lot more noise in our composite image. If we are to grab the ambient occlusion this time though and connect it to the viewer node, we can now see our image but only the ambient occlusion. So we can see any of the dark areas, that's where ambient occlusion is more present. And we can preview just about any of these nodes if we want. So for example, we could have a look at the normal values. We could have a look at the shadow values. Or we could have a look at the index values for the materials. What we are going to do right now, however, is we're going to be using some of these denoising outputs here. And along with that, we're going to be using the denoise node. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to keep our blur as it is at the moment. And we're going to add, with Shift and A, filter denoise. So I'm going to position it here. And let's take the blur out and let's use the denoise first. So let's take the image here and plug it into the image here. And actually, let's just preview this quickly. So I'm just going to position the output here to the input of the viewer node. And this is what we get at the moment. Now, you might already be able to see that there's a lot less noise. If I was to mute the denoise node with the M key, you should be able to instantly see the difference. So just by toggling the M key on and off, we can actually preview how this denoise node is affecting our image. But to get the best results, we also should be looking to use this denoising normal option here and plug it in to the normal input here, and then take the denoising albedo into here. So now, just by using a single node in the compositing workspace, we have been able to take a very grainy, very noisy render and really been able to clean it up and get rid of most of that noise that was present before. So now let's add the blur back in. So we're going to plug the image input into the image output, and then the same from the blur to the viewer, making sure that we hover our mouse over the correct nodes. You can see the line reappears because it's now a part of this sequence, so make sure that the blur node is selected and press the M key on your keyboard to unmute. Give it a couple of seconds to composite, and there we go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to save this result, save this image, and I'm just going to overwrite the blur.png, and now my new rendered image has been saved to my computer. Now, there is one issue with this setup. If you were to save your file, close your file, and then reopen the file, in order to get this working again, you would need to re-render the image. Now, with the help of the denoise node, image renders can get a lot shorter. However, it's still a bit of a pain that you would have to actually render an image again every single time that you open up Blender. So the best workaround here is to just save this as a special type of image and then replace this render layers node with that image. So the way we do that is we're going to come over to the output properties in the properties panel, and where it says output, we're going to define the output location. But before we do that, we're going to change the file format. The format that we're going to change this to is known as OpenEXR multilayer. Now make sure you select the multilayer one and not the standard EXR. So select OpenEXR multilayer, and then we're going to define an output. So left click on this icon here and then find somewhere to save your file. So I've got an EXR folder here, and I'm actually going to take this one that was originally created and just delete it. And then we're going to click on accept. And I've got to make sure that this part is empty just to make things a little bit easier. So accept there, so we can see that we have the output file here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to render the image again, but this time it's going to be rendered as an EXR. So go render, render image, and then just give it a few seconds to complete the render. So with that done, I'm just going to go image, save as image, and then we're just going to go to our EXR file, and we're just going to save this. So let's save it as dodgeball.exr. And then press enter. Oh, I've got to make sure that I type it correctly. And then just select save as image. Now I'm going to close this. I'm going to just move the render layers to the side, and we're going to hit Shift A, add an input, and then select image. So left click on image, and I'm just going to bring the image here. Now at the moment it only has two outputs, image and alpha, but that's because there's no image assigned to this node. So let's go open. We're going to find our EXR image and then just open it up in that node. Now you can see that it's shown up, but we still only have two nodes. So now we have this combined option and this alpha option. But what we can do is we can come down to where it says layer, composite, and we're going to just zoom in so you can see a little bit better. We're going to left click and then we're going to select view layer. As soon as we do that, all of our render passes become visible. Now this is only possible if you render and save an image as a .exr file, making sure that the file format is set to OpenEXR multi-layer. What this allows us to do, and I know that took a while to get there, but what this allows us to do is it allows us to plug these same values in and effectively replace the render layers node entirely, allowing us to basically do everything that we could before, but now we won't have to render every time we reopen Blender. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to finish off by plugging each of these where each of these were before. Okay, and once you've done that, if we just zoom out a little bit, you no longer need the render layers node here, so just left click and hit X to delete. And now we have a setup here that in the following tutorials we'll be able to add a lot more to and really be able to take a deep dive into how we can composite images and animations in Blender. Thanks guys, and I will see you in the next video. Hi guys, welcome to the second episode of our YouTube series on how to use the Compositor in Blender version 2.8. For today's episode, we are going to be focusing on color correction. So by the end of this video, you will know how to use many of the color-based nodes in the Compositor to improve the color grading of your images. Now, if you want to follow along with this 6-part series using your own projects, you are more than welcome to do so. However, if you are looking to use the project that we are using for this series, then you can download it via the link in the video description. But not only will you be getting all of the assets related to our project, if you sign up, you will also get access to our free Blender 2.8 PDF cheat sheet full of keyboard shortcuts that are commonly used in Blender for things like navigating the 3D viewport, creating animations, manipulating nodes in the Compositor, etc., as well as some of our top tips and tricks for making the most of your Blender experience and improving your workflow. On top of that, you will also have access to our bi-weekly newsletter for the latest information on all things related to Blender. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a node group for the denoise and blur nodes. To do that, we're going to left click and drag to create a selection box over the two nodes and release. So now each of these nodes have been selected. We're going to hit Ctrl and G on our keyboard to create a new group. To come out of this group, we're going to click on this button here, and you can see now we have a single node group that we can rename. So let's just rename this as denoise. And now we've got a single node where before we had two. And if we ever want to edit any of the properties of those nodes, we can click here to open up the group, and then we can make the changes. So for example, if we look to increase on the x-axis, we can do so here, allow it to composite, and it still has the same impact on the final result. So I'm just going to set that back to the value of 8 and then come out of the node group. Now let's have a look at some of the different ways in which we can manipulate the color values of our image. So we're going to start with the hue saturation value node. So hit Shift and A on your keyboard, go to the color menu and select hue saturation value, and we're going to position it here. So first of all, we have the image option here, which just plugs automatically into this denoise group. But we also have hue, saturation, value, and factor. The hue value represents the color of the image. So if we change this hue value, then all of the colors in the image are going to change as well. And they can change quite substantially. So setting this all the way up to 1, for example, allows us to see what is effectively an inverted image in terms of the colors compared to the original. So where there was a dark red, there's now a very light blue. Where there was a very light blue, there's now this very reddish brown for the walls, etc. Then we have the saturation. The saturation is basically how strong the colors are. So if we reduce the value of the saturation, it creates a very washed out image. So let's demonstrate that by decreasing the value of the saturation. And if we just give that a moment to composite, you can see that the colors are still the same, but the entire image is far more washed out. If we increase the saturation value beyond 1, then we get a much greater level of contrast between these colors because they're much more vibrant in their appearance. And then we have the value option. Now this is effectively the brightness of the image overall. So if we decrease this value, then we are going to be decreasing the overall brightness of the image. And if we increase the value, we are in essence making our image brighter. The factor value represents how much of an effect this node has on our final result. So if we reduce this factor value, then the effects that the 3 values above have on the image are substantially reduced. So if I increase the saturation and the hue here, this is the result that we get when the factor value is set to 0.34. If we set it to 0, then these values basically don't really mean anything. And if we set this all the way to 1, it maximizes the impact that each of these values have. So the hue, the saturation, and the value are all in full effect if the factor is set to 1. So now that we know what the hue is, what the saturation is, and what this value means, let's take a look at a different mode used for color correction, and that is the RGB curves node. Now, if you go to your preferences panel, and then you look for an add-on known as Node Wrangler, so make sure that you are in the add-ons tab, left click, and just type Node Wrangler. You want to make sure that this option is ticked. It just makes working with nodes a lot easier in Blender. So make sure that this is ticked and then close. So as long as the Node Wrangler add-on is active, what we can do here is we can select the hue saturation value node. We're going to hit Shift and S on our keyboard and go to the color menu and select RGB curves. So how do RGB curves work? Well, we have 4 channels. So we have the main color channel, we have the red channel, green channel, and blue channel. And we can manipulate this curve here to change the influence of these colors and also change the amount of contrast in the image. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate how to change the contrast. So with the color channel selected, I'm going to start by adding 2 points to this curve. You can do so just by left clicking. So left click 1 and left click 2. Now we're going to position these points. So for example, if I wanted to reduce the contrast for this image, then I can take this point and bring it up and take this point and bring it down. So you can see that we are able to affect the contrast of the image. So a lot of it appears to be a bit more washed out because this part of the curve is almost completely flat. Not entirely flat, you can still see the curve there, but it has been flattened compared to what it was before. Now this area in the center of the curve, this represents the midtones of the image, and we'll get back to what midtones are when we have a look at a couple of other nodes. But for now, if I want to reverse this and increase the contrast, I can take this and bring it down, and take this and bring it up. So now we have a different curve, and it has a different impact on the level of contrast for our image. There are also points in the corners that you can manipulate. So if we grab this point and bring it up, then it will dramatically increase the brightness of the image. So here, if we really increase it, and let's actually bring this up as well, you can see that the image is starting to appear very white, but it also begins to appear very washed out because of the reduced contrast that this creates. So if we pop this point down here, the image appears brighter, almost foggier, but we still get quite a lot of contrast because of the shape of the curve. Now, on the other side, if we take this point and move it down, then this doesn't always have as strong as an effect, but it's basically making the darker parts of the image even darker. So if we position this lower, and then position this lower, you'll then begin to see that the darker areas, so under the bench for example, under the dodgeball, they begin to appear just that little bit darker as well. Now if we take this same point, move it all the way to the top, but also begin to move it across the top and release, then you actually begin to see something different. So with this curve, because it's so steep, it's making the brightest parts of the image extremely bright, but because of how steep the curve is, it's only affecting specific parts of the image. So with this, you can begin to get an idea of how the RGB curve can be used to prioritize different parts of the image depending on the levels of brightness and contrast. Now there are also other options here, so you can once again manipulate the factor value of the RGB curves to help determine exactly how much it's going to impact your image. You also have the ability to delete any points that you have created, so we can select this point for example and then click on this X button to delete it, and then let's do the same with this point and then reposition this in the corner. And then you have the black and white levels. So the black level is by default set to pure black and the white level is set to pure white. So with the black level here, if we increase this value, then what it will do is it will actually darken the image. So it kind of has the reverse effect to what you would expect. However, if we were to make the white level darker, so let's bring that value down, then it would actually make the image itself appear much brighter. And then you can manipulate the RGB channels independently. So for example, if we were to go to the blue channel here, we can begin to manipulate the values of the blue channel. And as we do that, you can actually begin to see that the tone of the image is beginning to change. So by bringing this point down, for example, we've added a very greenish tint to our entire image. If we bring it up here, for example, it's actually increasing the amount of blue that's present in the image. So now let's move on to our next node, which is going to be the color correction node. So make sure the RGB curves is selected, hit Shift and S, color, then color correction. Now this is quite a large node, so we're just going to grab our viewer node and move it across. And there are a lot of values in the color correction node, so I'm just going to go over what each of the values at the top are and also the ones at the side, and then that can give you an idea of what each of these values represent. So we have the saturation, which we have already discussed. So saturation is how strong a color is, so the lower this value, the more washed out that color is going to appear. The contrast value indicates just how much of a difference there is between those colors, but we should already be fairly familiar with these two by now. What are quite new terms are the gamma, the gain, and the lift. Now next we have the gamma value. So if we increase the gamma value here to 1.5, what this is going to do is it's actually going to brighten the overall image. If we decrease this value below 1, so to 0.5, then it's going to darken the image, but it's going to keep the level of contrast and saturation that is currently set. Now these gamma values, they will affect the image as a whole, especially when we're manipulating the master value. However, it prioritizes the midtones. So you have the shadows of the image, you have highlights in the image, which are normally where the light bounces off the brighter colors, like the cones for example. And then everything in between that is the midtones. So when we manipulate the gamma value, we are mainly manipulating the midtone levels, but it does overlap to affect the shadows and the highlights as well. Now the gain value has a stronger influence on the highlights of the image, but again there is always going to be an overlap, so it is going to affect the overtone or the midtones and the shadows as well. Now if I set the gamma back to 1 and then increase the gain acts as a multiplier. So it acts as a multiplier to effectively up the brightness of the image without adversely affecting the shadows of the image. So if we increase this to a very high value, for example, you can see that the image becomes very, very bright, but it's still very clear where the shadows are located. Now if we reduce this below 1, then that will basically reduce the highlights and create an overall darker looking image. And then finally we have the lift option here. Now the lift option is not a multiplier like the gain, and it generally prioritizes the shadows. So the value of the lift is set to 0, and you can make it either positive or negative. So if you increase this value above 0, this adds brightness to the overall image itself rather than multiplying it, which is why you can see that it has affected the contrast and saturation of the image as well. Now if we manipulated the gain, you would see that that would not be the case. So if we set that back to 0 and increase the gain to around 2, you can see that we are able to brighten the image, but we do not necessarily lose our level of saturation in the colors. If we set that back to 1 and reduce the lift below 0, then we will begin to darken the overall image. Now each of those values focused on the master channel, so it influences the image as a whole, but if you want to better isolate parts of the image, you can use some of the values below. So for example, if I wanted to increase the contrast of the shadows, I can increase this value here. So if we increase that to say 1.7, you can see that all of the shadows have become a lot darker. In fact, that's too dark for my taste. Now with many of these values, it's preferable to make minor changes. So going from 1 to 1.7 here was a substantial change to the look of our image, and it doesn't represent itself very well. So if we change this to say 1.1, then we might get something that looks a little bit better. So here we can see that the shadows appear darker than what they did before, but not so dark that we begin to lose the detail. We might also want to perhaps increase the gain in the highlights. So if we increase the highlights a lot, so 2.7, this doesn't actually appear to be having as much a difference, because as a multiplier, the gain value actually is a little bit better behaved than some of the others, such as the lift option, for example. But here we could, to avoid things getting washed out, perhaps use a value of 1.3 to just increase the gain of the highlights. And then maybe let's do one more. Let's increase the saturation of the midtones. So we can increase the saturation here, and if we choose a higher value, so we can go up to 4, the maximum value, it really adds to the saturation of all of the areas that Blender considers to be in that sort of middle of the range area for the contrast. So if we take this and we push it down to something like 1.3, just to add a bit more saturation to the floor and the walls, etc. And if you have a look down here at our viewer node and render result, you can compare these two images and begin to see some of the changes that are taking effect because of the nodes that we have set up and because of the changes that we have made to the color correction. So up next, we're going to demonstrate the color balance node, which can work in a similar way to color correction. So hit Shift and S and change it to color balance. And this time, instead of numerical values, we have these color wheels here that we can manipulate. Now, when manipulating the color balance, again, like the color correction, it's important to remember that a lot of the time you will only need to make slight adjustments to your images. Now, we should know at this point what lift, gamma and gain do. So we have the lift option here. So if we were to increase the brightness value for the lift, then it increases the overall brightness of our image. And then if we decrease this value, then it will add darkness to the image as well. But it focuses here, you can see, more on the shadows. So in this case, it does appear to work just a little bit differently to our color correction. So if we go back to our color correction, and actually rather than just swapping out, let's just add it in. So go color correction, and I end up swapping it out by mistake. So let's bring the viewer node back in, and then hit Shift A, color correction. And we're just going to take a minute to just compare these two. So if I just mute this with the M key, brings it back to the way it was before. And then we manipulate the lift value here, so reduce the master lift. You can actually see that the lift value here has a much stronger effect than manipulating the color balance. So what I would like to do normally is, if I was to use both of these nodes, which you can do absolutely, then what I would do is I would manipulate the lift value of the color balance and then just keep the lift value here set to 0. Now don't forget, you do have other lift values that you can manipulate as well. So if I mute this again and then set the shadow value of the lift to point, or should I say, let's just go minus 0.2, that begins to look a little bit more like what we get over here, but then it really focuses on the shadows and doesn't affect the rest of the image as much. So you can play about with these two separate nodes to see which effects you prefer to use. Personally, I prefer to use the lift values in the color balance node because I feel like I have just that little bit more control and the effects are just a little bit more subtle. So hit the M key to bring the color balance node back into effect, and then I'm just going to increase this value to about here. Then we have the gamma values here, which we can affect using this slider. So we can increase the gamma value to a brighter color, or we can decrease the gamma value to a darker tone. And then finally we have the gain, which again acts as a multiplier, mainly for the highlights. So we can increase this value to increase the gain in our highlights and make the overall image appear much brighter. Or we can reduce the gain to make the overall image appear darker. So I'm just going to set that back to roughly the center. And before we switch up what nodes we're using again, you may notice that we have the option to change the formula that is used for the color balance. So if we left click, we actually have two options. We have lift gamma gain, which is what we've been using, and then offset power slope. So if we go offset power slope, the offset replaces the lift, the power replaces the gamma, and the slope replaces the gain. Now the power, for example, is effectively the gamma but inverted. So if we increase the brightness of the power, we are effectively going to make the image itself darker. And then if we perform the opposite effect, then we make the overall image appear brighter. But you can also see we begin to lose a bit of detail here as well. Now the offset, which replaces the lift option, actually adjusts the overall brightness of the image. Now the lift option focuses mainly on the shadows in general. So if we manipulate the lift option again, and we have to remember that we have adjusted the gamma, so we need to reset that, then you will see that we're able to manipulate the image as a whole with the lift, but the priority is on the darker areas. Now when it comes to the offset, you can see here that if we set this to the center here, then we end up with a very washed out image. So actually for the offset, this is normally by default set to its darkest value. Now we can manipulate the basis value here if we ever wanted to change that. Then finally we have the slope, which acts very similarly to the gain. It's again a multiplier. So if we increase this value, so let's make the value brighter for the slope, then it's going to focus mainly on increasing the brightness of the highlights. And then we can decrease the brightness of those highlights by reducing this value. And again, we can see that it does have that effect on the image overall. But the slope, much like the gain does in color correction, focuses on the highlights of the image in particular. Now, while we have looked at many different nodes for color correction, or quite a few I should say, not too many, but we've had a look at things like hue, saturation, value, color correction, color balance, etc. There are some color nodes that I personally consider to be a little bit redundant, so I'm just going to show you one of these other nodes as an example. So we'll go Shift A, color, and you can see we've got options like this gamma option here, which is a very simple node, and it's been around for a very long time at this point. And all it is you just plug into the image input and then plug the output into the image input here for the viewer node, and then you can use the gamma value, and it's already had an effect on the image, and all you can do is just increase the gamma value here. So we can increase it to 1.8, and what that does is it almost acts like the power value here in the color balance. So if I was to actually use a split viewer node for this, so let's hit Shift A and then go output split viewer. We're going to take the color correction here and pop it into the image node here, and then we're going to take the gamma and plug it into here and left click to view. So if I set this down to 1, we should have very similar images either side. Now the reason why there is a slight difference is because of the color balance node that isn't completely set to its default. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute the color balance node with the M key, and then that should level out both sides of this image. And now if we just compare the gamma value here to the gamma value here, if we increase this gamma value to a value of 1.8 and then press enter, you can see that it makes the overall image a lot brighter. But if we do the same thing with the gamma value here, so set it to 1.8, then it effectively does the reverse operation and begins to make the image appear darker. Now, because this is a value that can be manipulated both in color correction and in color balance, but in different ways, I tend to never use nodes like the gamma node. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to delete the gamma node by pressing X, and let's delete the split viewer as well, and just plug color correction back in so that we can once again view the image. Now I'm going to set the gamma back to 1. And now I'm going to show you yet another node, but this time I'm going to demonstrate how you can convert your image to a black and white image. So it's going to go from RGB to black and white. So we're going to go Shift and A to once again bring up our add menu, but instead of going to the color menu, we are instead going to go to the converter menu, and we are going to select RGB to BW. So this represents the red, green, blue image and converts it to a black and white image. So we're going to left click and we're going to bring it into our setup, and if I attach it here and let that composite, it converts our entire image from RGB to grayscale. So now there is absolutely no saturation in our image whatsoever. This node here completely eliminates all of the saturation in the image. But what if you wanted to convert the image to effectively be black and white with the exception of a single color? So for example, what if I wanted to have my entire image appear as it does, but for the red of the dodgeball to still be saturated? Well, I can do that with a different node altogether. So select the RGB to BW, and then hit Shift S to change it, and then we're going to go color, and this time we're going to go hue correct. So as soon as we do that, you can see that our image is back to normal in terms of its colors. But we can see if we zoom in on our hue correct node here, we have a spectrum going from red to yellow to green to blue, etc. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to isolate the red of the dodgeball. So we can do that by grabbing any of these points that are located in the channels for the other colors, and then just lower this down to the bottom. As soon as I do that, you will begin to see that it's having an effect here on our floor. Now if I take this one and move it all the way down, just let that composite, now the entirety of our floor here has lost its color because the green values here have basically been set to 0. So let's continue to do that with these other colors. So just bring them down, and as we continue to do that, we continue to reduce the colors that are visible in our image. So I'm going to reduce this one to about here, and let's reduce the yellow, and then just bring this one across, and bring this one across as well. And there we go. So now if we zoom out and just pan our view, you can see that we have an image where we have been able to isolate a single color in our render and effectively desaturate the rest of the image. So that's going to finish up how we can use different nodes to affect the colors that are visible in our rendered image. In the next tutorial, we're going to be looking at nodes that allow us to create distortions to our image and also learn how we can overlay one image on top of another. Thanks guys, I hope you have learned a lot in this tutorial, and I will see you in the next video. Hi guys, for today's video we're going to be focusing on how you can combine an image with transparency and overlay it onto your existing image. We're also going to be taking a look at a few new nodes that we haven't looked at yet, including the color ramp node, the ellipse mask and lens distortion, as well as beginning to reorganize our more complicated node setups, making things a little bit easier to use. Now, if you want to follow along with this 6-part series using your own projects, you are more than welcome to do so. However, if you are looking to use the project that we are using for this series, then you can download it via the link in the video description. But not only will you be getting all of the assets related to our project, if you sign up, you will also get access to our free Blender 2.8 PDF cheat sheet, full of keyboard shortcuts that are commonly used in Blender for things like navigating the 3D viewport, creating animations, manipulating nodes in the compositor, etc., as well as some of our top tips and tricks for making the most of your Blender experience and improving your workflow. On top of that, you will also have access to our bi-weekly newsletter for the latest information on all things related to Blender. So for this tutorial, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate how we can add one image and overlay it on top of another. So I'm just going to zoom out slightly and just use the middle mouse button to bring my nodes up to here. Then we're going to go Shift and A, Input, and then select Image, and we're going to position the image here. Next, locate the image that you want to bring into your project. So I'm going to go open, and then I'm going to locate my image. I then select the image that I want to bring into my project and click on open image. So now if we zoom in on this image node, we should get a display of our image, which is the same as what would happen up here with our .exr. So now what we need to do is we need to find a way of overlaying this image on top of this one. And there are a couple of ways of doing it, but I am going to use an alpha over node. So I'm going to grab the viewer node and position it here. Then I'm going to go Shift and A, and then we're going to have to find our alpha over node, which should be under color, alpha over, left click, and then position here. Next, I'm going to take the image here and plug it into the bottom input here. Let that load up, and you can see it's not quite perfect. So there's one or two issues with the image that has been brought in. But the easiest way to get rid of this for now is to just click on this button here. So if we just expand the alpha over node and just zoom in on it slightly, this convert premal option will allow us to ensure that the rest of the image remains transparent. So up next, what we want to do is we want to move this title Balliol design to the top corner. So how do we move an image? We've been able to overlay it on top of our existing image, but how do we now move this title from the center to the top corner? Well, there are a few distort nodes that we can use in order to achieve this. So we're going to go Shift A, and we're going to go down to where it says distort, and we're going to start by selecting transform. Actually no, we're going to start by selecting scale, because we want the right scale first before we move it. So let's select scale and drag it in to about here. And by default nothing will happen because the X and Y scale are both set to 1. If we increase these values, so let's left click and drag to select both values, and then let's use a value of 3 just as an example and enter. If we let that composite, you can see that it has scaled up the image to 3 times its initial size on both axes, which is far too big. Now I do want it to be a little bit bigger than what it currently is, but not that big. So let's set the values here to 1.2 and then press enter. So that looks like a good enough size. Now we need to move it to the top corner of our image, and we can do that with a translate node. So Shift A, distort, translate, and we will plug it in between the scale and the alpha over. Now the X and Y values represent the pixels of the image, so these are going to have to be very high values. So for example, if I set X to 200 and press enter, then it's going to move our title image 200 pixels across the x-axis. Now that's going in the opposite direction that I want, so I'm going to use a value of, let's try minus 350. So a value of minus 350, that's looking good. I think we can go a little bit further along, so minus 375 and enter. And then let's try increasing the Y value. So we want it to go up, so we can use a positive value here. Let's try 400 and then press enter. And that's looking pretty good. In fact, we're just going to use the value of minus 400 for the x-axis. So here we've been able to A, add a new image to our composite, B, made sure that we are displaying the alpha channels of that image with the alpha over node, C, being able to scale this new image, and D, being able to move the image. Now, we can actually combine these two into a single node, and I'm not talking about a node group, I'm talking about a single node, which is the transform node. So I might want to add a tiny bit of rotation to this as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to delete these two nodes, just plug the image back in, and then I'm going to go Shift A, distort, and select transform. Now you can see we've also got the rotate node as well, but we're not going to use that. We're going to use transform, and we're going to move the transform to here. Now if we zoom in on this node, you can see we can manipulate the X and Y values for the location, we can manipulate the angle, and we can manipulate the scale. However, in this case, the scale is limited to a single value. So this single value represents both the X and Y axes. So let's manipulate that first, 1.2, and enter. Just let that scale up, and then we'll manipulate the X value to minus 400 and the Y value to positive 400. So that gets it into the right position. Now let's add just a small angle to the title. So let's go 5 degrees and press enter. And that's looking pretty good. But looking at it, I do think I would prefer it if the rotation didn't change at all. If you want to use this to change the rotation of the title, then by all means, but I think I'm actually going to set this back to 0. And I actually think that is an adequate position for our image. So now if we zoom out, we can see that we've got quite a few nodes forming, and I just want to reorganize our node tree here, and I'm going to do that by creating some frames. So I'm going to start with our title image and our transform node, and what we're going to do is we're going to select these nodes, and if we go to add, which you can also do via the menu up here, go to layout and select frame, you can add in a frame, and then you can select a node, drag it inside the frame, and the frame itself will expand so that you can fit that node inside. So now it's just a case of grabbing this transform node and positioning it inside the frame, and then just grabbing and relocating it to about here. So you notice that the frame scales in size based on the positioning of the nodes. If we left click on the frame itself, we can move the frame and all the nodes that are inside of that frame. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to change the color of the frame, and we're going to make this a green color, and then just move the frame down here a bit. And then what I want to do is I want to just take the color nodes and position them in their own frame. So let's left click and drag, and to be honest we don't even need to do that because we can just go and add the frame, position it here, and then position each of these nodes inside that frame. Reorganize, and then select the frame and give it a color. Let's give this one a blue color so that it's easy to distinguish between the two frames. And one thing that I haven't done is I haven't labeled these frames. So with this color frame, we're going to go to where it says label, left click, and just type in color. And with this frame, this represents our title image, so I am going to label it as title. Then let's look at further reorganizing these nodes, and one thing that we can do is we can enable snapping to help us. So the snapping tool is located up here by this magnet icon. So left click to enable snapping, and then you can snap to different elements. So you can snap to the grid, you can snap to the x-axis, to the y-axis, or to both axes. So I'm going to start by using grid snapping. I'm going to grab my main image, and you can see that it looks glitchy, but it's actually because it's snapping to the grid behind it. So I'm going to position it about here. Then I'm going to change the method of snapping to Y. Grab our denoise group here and snap it to here so that it's in line with our main image. And if we try and snap the frame, so let's grab the color frame, you will see that we can sort of do this as well, but it is just a little bit, as you can see, just a little bit more glitchy. So it is better if you can to snap the individual nodes just like I am doing here. So now let's take this alpha over node, and I think we'll pop it in about here, and we'll take the viewer node position here. And for now I'm just going to change to the node X option and position this frame about here. If we just move across, we can line that up very nicely. Okay, so that looks much simpler than what it did just a few moments ago. I've noticed that the color balance is still muted. I'm just going to unmute that, and that will probably have a minor impact on our scene, but I actually quite like that. So at the moment it's just darkening the final image, which actually looks pretty good. So I am going to leave it at that. So what we're going to be doing next is we're going to be adding a bit of distortion to the image itself. So if this was an image shot by a camera, there'd be a little bit of distortion. There's always distortion with whatever camera that you use. So we're going to be using what is known as a lens distortion node. So we're going to be plugging the lens distortion in about this area here. So let's hit Shift A, distort, lens distortion. Now I only want it to affect the main image to start with, so we're going to plug it in here before the alpha over node. Left click, and then I'm just going to zoom in on this node just so you can see what it looks like. And nothing has changed because neither of these values have been altered. First of all, we have distortion. Let's just make that a little bit bigger. And if we increase the distortion, and we don't even have to increase it by much, but we start to get this sort of fisheye lens effect. Now, as you can see, just by changing the value from 0 to 0.1, that's quite an exaggerated effect. If you really increase it to, say, 0.9, then it creates a very strong distortion. Now, this might be the effect that you're looking for, but I'm looking for something that's going to be very, very subtle. I'm going to use a value of 0.02 and then press enter. Now, I don't want the image to begin cropping in. I want it to maintain its original shape. I am going to enable this fit option, and that's going to make sure that regardless of what this distortion value is set to, we're still going to maintain the same straight outline for the image. As an example, if I increase my distortion value, the image itself becomes a lot more distorted, but it also begins to zoom in on the image in order to maintain the pixel ratio. I'm going to set that back to 0.02, and the option below it is dispersion. Now, when we talk about dispersion for lens distortion, what this is going to do is it's effectively going to create some discoloration around some of the edges of our objects. So if I make this a high value to start with, so let's go 0.3, let that composite, you can see that we're again beginning to zoom in a bit more, so it's creating more of a distortion for the image. But more importantly, you can see around the dodgeball here that the color is sort of blending from red to this sort of dark brown yellowish tint. If we were to come over to the viewer node and just zoom in on this area, you can see the effect that the distortion value is having on the edges of this object, but it's only doing that in certain parts. If we increase the dispersion even further, then we'll be able to see this effect even more. Set that to 1, for example, and you can see now that the effect is so strong that not only do we have this discoloration here, but it's almost blurred around the outsides of the image. Now, much like distortion, I like to keep dispersion to a very low value. So 0.02 again, I believe is more than suitable for what I want from this image. Now, lens distortion is a node that's sole purpose is actually to allow Blender to act like a real world camera in terms of how the image is viewed. These distortion and dispersion options, actually they're creating imperfections in your image, the same imperfections that you see with just about any camera. Of course, a higher quality camera will have less distortion and less dispersion. Now, what if you wanted to crop your image to a specific part? Well, we can do so with the crop node. What I'm going to do here is I am going to add my crop node in, Shift A. I'm going to go to distort and crop, and I'm going to plug it in here, and it's not going to do anything apart from get rid of the entire image, with the exception of our title here, because this crop node is not connected to the title. In order for us to begin to view our image, we have to manipulate these values. If we start by manipulating this up value, let's set this to 1000, for example. Let's go 1000, and then let's set this right value to 500. And then we should be able to see a part of our image. So now it's a case of beginning to manipulate these values to see what we can come up with. If I move the right value and then the up value, the goal would be to try and get our entire image to start with. So you can see here, or you could pretty much guess, that these values are the pixels. We set this to 1920 by 1080. We basically crop to the original size of the image. Now, rather than manipulating these values at this point, what we can do is we can grab the corners and begin to crop our image using the corners themselves. I'm just going to manipulate our node tree so that it's out of the way. And then let's isolate the dodgeball. So we can position this, move down, and then allow that to composite. And there you go. So now we have a cropped image that only shows our main dodgeball. The one thing to note here is that the image size in the viewer node is still the same. It's just that the rest of our image has been replaced by a transparent background. If you want to crop the image size so that the transparency actually goes away, you can left click on crop image size here in the properties, or if you find the node itself, you have the same options here. So if we left click, now you can only see the part of the image that had been cropped. In fact, at this point, even the title image has disappeared because Blender considers the main image to be the main image of this setup. Now, if we were to reorder these two, so if we take the bottom input here and plug it into the top input, let that load up, you can now see that we can begin to see the title image above, but we can't actually see all of it. So what we're going to do here is we're simply going to revert this back to its original. And since I prefer to have the entire image anyway, we're just going to delete the crop. So just hit X to delete, and then plug in the lens distortion output to the alpha over input. Let that composite, and we're back to our original image. The next thing we're going to look at is how we can manipulate the color values of our title image, but using a new node known as a color ramp. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a color ramp node, Shift A, I'm going to add converter and select color ramp. And then we're going to position the color ramp. Let's position it here so we're changing the color before we manipulate the transform. As you can see here, when we change the values using the color ramp, you can see we've got a black and a white value. We're also changing the values of the transparency that surrounds our image. So now we're getting basically different shades of grey. To solve this, we're going to basically do two things. First of all, we're just going to move these nodes across, and then we're going to add an alpha convert node. So go to converter, alpha convert, and position it about here. I'm just going to turn off snapping to make things a bit easier. Now you can see that's a little bit better, but we still can't see the image underneath. What we can tell based on our color ramp is that the black values of the image represent basically this point here. So if we just zoom in on the color ramp, you see we have these different points here that we can left click to select. So this black value here, this basically represents everything that is behind the title. What we need to do is we need to make this into an alpha channel. We can do that very easily by left clicking on the color and setting the alpha value to 0. Once we do that and allow it to composite, then the black disappears and we can see our image. But while it is still just about there, the title is no longer what you would call visible. So what we're going to do is we're going to first of all add another one of these points or color stops as they are known as. And then I'm going to make sure that the alpha value of this color stop is set all the way up to 1. And then we're just going to drag it up to about here and change the color to green. So if I do that and allow it to composite, you can see that we're beginning to change the color of the title. The positioning of these color stops will influence what the color of the title actually is. And you can see that this specific image was created so that the two words here end up as different colors. If we position this color stop here and move it all the way up and release, then we end up actually with a pure white word here. So once you understand exactly what your color ramp is doing to your image, then you can begin to manipulate these values to get the effect that you want. So I know, for example, that these two color stops are in pretty much the right place. So now I can just manipulate what these colors actually are. I think I'm going to go with the green value. I'm going to set that to maybe a sort of purplish color. And then with the white value, let's set that to let's go with a bright yellow. So something like that. And so now, using the color ramp node, we have been able to successfully alter the colors of our title image. And if we ever want to manipulate those colors, we can always come back to the color ramp node. So now we're coming towards the end of the tutorial here. And one thing that I want to do before we finish is I want to add what is known as an ellipse mask. Now, an ellipse mask is going to allow us to basically brighten the center of our image. It's basically going to create a vignette that's going to brighten the center of the image but darken the outside. In order to bring in an ellipse mask, we're going to hit Shift and A. We're going to go down to where it says matte and we're going to select ellipse mask. And let's position the mask. Let's actually position it after the alpha over node. Actually, no, let's do it before. Let's do it before alpha over, but after lens distortion. This is what we get right now. We basically get a grayscale image behind, and the ellipse mask itself is this very obvious white color that's just overlapping the image. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure it's the right size. Let's set the width to a very high value, 0.95, and then the height to a value of, let's go about 0.5 for the height. To solve the issue that we have here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take my ellipse mask out of this setup, move it down here, just reorganize things a little bit, and I'm going to add a mix RGB node. I'm going to go Shift A, color, and then mix. We're going to pop the mix RGB node into here, and then we're going to plug the mask for the ellipse mask into here, and then we're going to change this from mix to multiply. Once we do that, you can see the image within the ellipse mask, but not around the outside. To fix that, what we're going to do is we're going to add a blur node. So go to filter and then blur. And then we're going to change this from Gaussian to fast Gaussian, and then select relative. So relative uses percentages along the X and Y axis. And if we increase this to say 33, and then increase this to something similar, so 28, then you begin to see the ellipse mask take effect on our image. So we've got these darker corners, but it maintains and even highlights the brightness in the center. And then we can manipulate the factor value to determine how strong we want our ellipse mask to be. So a factor of 1 looks just a bit too strong for my taste. So I might just go with a value of 0.8, because I only want it to be a relatively subtle effect. And then it begins to look a little bit more suitable around those edges. So we've done a lot of work at this point. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take these guys here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's take number 5 as well. And what we'll do is we're just going to create a frame for these 5 to fit in. Let's go and hit Shift A, Layout, Frame. And we're just going to plug each of these into this frame. And then reposition. Once I've done that, I'm going to select the frame. We can name this as distortion. And then let's give it a pinkish color. Zoom in a little bit, and then let's just make sure that these are snapped into place. We're going to once again enable snapping. And then we're just going to position these so that they pretty much line up with each other on either the X or Y axes. If we zoom out, this is what we have so far for our composite tree. And I think the main takeaway from this is, as long as you have a good idea of what each of these nodes are doing at this point, then you should be good to go. If anything confuses you, always make sure to just rewind and just have a look at a certain part. I do leave timestamps in the description because these are relatively long YouTube tutorials. So if you ever want a recap on, say, the lens distortion, for example, I will leave a timestamp to let you know where in the video we talk about lens distortion. But that's it from me for this video. Thanks guys, and I will see you in the next one. In this episode of the Blender Compositor Beginner course, we're going to be taking a look at a few more nodes to create some new effects for our image. These include the bilateral blur node and a comparison between that and the traditional blur node, as well as learning how we can use the glare node to create some additional lighting effects for our image. That and more is coming up in episode 4. Now, if you want to follow along with this 6-part series using your own projects, you are more than welcome to do so. However, if you are looking to use the project that we are using for this series, then you can download it via the link in the video description. But not only will you be getting all of the assets related to our project, if you sign up, you will also get access to our free Blender 2.8 PDF cheat sheet, full of keyboard shortcuts that are commonly used in Blender for things like navigating the 3D viewport, creating animations, manipulating nodes in the compositor, etc., as well as some of our top tips and tricks for making the most of your Blender experience and improving your workflow. On top of that, you will also have access to our bi-weekly newsletter for the latest information on all things related to Blender. The first thing that we are going to cover in this video is how to reroute the connections between nodes. For example, in our current setup, we have the transform node here and its image output that is directly connected to the image input of the alpha over node here. However, the connection lies behind the blur and ellipse mask nodes, which have no relationship to this connection. What we need to do here to make things appear less confusing is to reroute this connection. To do that, I'm going to hold Shift and A on my keyboard to bring up the Add menu, then make sure I select Layout and then Reroute. Now I can position this reroute point anywhere in my editor. I'm going to position it about here, and then what I can do is I can grab the image output and plug it in to this new reroute point. Then I can take the reroute point and plug it directly into the alpha over's image input. This way it becomes easier to see which nodes are connected to each other. Now at this point I want to start from scratch before looking at any other nodes, and the main reason why is because I don't want the setup to appear too complex. What we're going to do is we're going to take pretty much all of these nodes with the exception of the viewer node and the image node, and we are going to create a group for all of these nodes and just set them to one side rather than deleting them. I'm going to first of all select all of the nodes that I want, including their frames. Then we're going to hit Ctrl and G to position all of these nodes inside a group. We're going to label this as first composite, and then press enter. And then let's come out of this node tree to the parent node tree and just zoom in, and this is our node group. So we're going to update the name here as well to first composite. And then I'm just going to deconnect all of these nodes, because at this point I want to start from scratch, and that means just positioning this over here. And let's bring our viewer node closer in, and once again connect up the combined output with the image input to get what is our original image. For this video, our main focus is going to be on some of the filter nodes that we can use. And the first one I want to preview is going to be the filter node itself. So I'm going to go Shift and A, go to Filter and select Filter. Then plug the filter node into here by left clicking. Give that a second to composite, and at the moment it's set to soften, but before we preview the options here, there is one old node that I would like to bring back, and that's going to be the denoise node, which, as you may be aware, is also found in the filter menu. So let's bring back that denoise node and plug it in here. Then we're going to connect the albedo and the denoising normal. At the moment I have snapping still turned on, but I don't really need it to be turned on at this moment in time, so we're going to just turn snapping off. And now let's turn our attention back to this filter node, which is currently set to soften. And when set to this, it does exactly what you would imagine it does. It softens the image, so it basically softens the edges of each object. If we left click here, we can see we have a variety of options. The next one is the sharpen option. I'm just going to zoom in on the dodgeball, so I'm going to select the viewer node, and if I hold down the Alt key and then press V, I can zoom in on my image in the actual editor. If I change the filter node to sharpen and allow that to composite, the edges around all of the objects in our scene become much more visible. This does, however, create some artifacts around those edges. What we can do is we can reduce the factor value to reduce the influence of this specific node. If we reduce it down to around 0.27, for example, we still have that sharpening effect, but it's not as strong and we don't get as much additional noise around the edges. We also have some other options. We're going to just preview these quickly. Many of them are quite similar to each other. We have, first of all, Laplace, and I'm just going to let each one composite and bring the values of the factors back up to 1 so that you can see exactly what's going on. Here, with a factor value set to 1, it creates this almost neon-like effect. And we can get similar results with some of the other options here. So we have Sobel, we have Pre-Wit, we have Kirsch, and we have Shadow. Now, Shadow itself does work very differently to the ones that come before it, but with this one in particular, I do find that you really need, if you're going to use it, a low factor value. Some of these require a very subtle factor value, and depending on what you want, some of them, like Kirsch for example, can work very well with high factor values if this is the sort of abstract look that you're going for. Now, this image is actually really interesting in its current state. There's a lot of detail and effects here that would be extremely difficult to achieve through the initial process of modeling materials and lighting. We're going to save this image, or at least I'm going to save this image, because I actually really like the look of this image. And you will see that I'm still using the .exr format, so I'm going to come up here to change that to PNG. I'm going to name this as Neon Dodgeball. Press enter, and then save as image. Before going any further, I don't want to have to repeat that process of changing my file format. I am instead going to change it one final time here in the output, because we no longer need the EXR file. So we're going to change the file format from OpenEXR multilayer back to PNG. That way, the next time we want to save an image, we know that we can save that image as a PNG. With the image saved, I'm now going to delete our filter node and replace it with a bilateral blur node. Now remember, if you are using the Node Wrangler add-on, you can make sure that the node is selected, hold Shift and then press S, go to Filter, and then we're going to select bilateral blur. We can see the effect that it already has on our scene, but I want to compare this to the regular blur node. which means we're going to select both of these. So hold down the Shift key and select the viewer node. And we can use a split viewer node, but I just prefer to use 2 viewer nodes for something like this. Hold Shift D, bring these 2 duplicates down, select bilateral blur, hit Shift S and change it to a blur node, and plug the image output into the image input of the blur node. Now I can select the viewer node that I want to be visible in the background. Let's zoom in on these 2 nodes. We are already aware of how the blur node works and how we can use the X and Y values to increase the blur. Let's recap on that by changing these values to a value like 25. Let that composite, and we can see just how much blur that creates. But bilateral blur works just a little bit differently to what normal blur does. It has some different options. If we select this viewer node to preview bilateral blur, we first of all have iterations, so we can perform the calculations of this node over and over depending on how many iterations we set. If we were to increase this to 3, for example, the blur effect would repeat itself 3 times. I normally do set this value to 1 unless I'm setting these 2 values, the color sigma and space sigma, down to much lower values. The color sigma here indicates the threshold of the different colors in the image and basically tells the node and tells Blender where the edges should go based on the colors of the image. The space sigma, on the other hand, focuses on the radius of the blur itself. For example, if we reduce the space sigma down to a very low value, say 0.1, we are considerably reducing the radius of the blur. That means in this case the blur is a lot less visible as a result of the reduction of the space sigma value. If we increase this value to something extremely high, then the image itself becomes extraordinarily blurred because the radius is almost overlapping itself in places. So it's almost like increasing the iterations if you set this value up really high, but you don't really want to use it that way. If you want to increase the iterations, you simply have the iterations value here. In most cases, you can set the value anywhere between 0.1 and 5 to get the results that you are looking for. So if you want less blur, you can use a very low value for the space sigma. But if you want more blur, then you can use a higher value, such as 4. Now I am going to actually turn this back to its default value of 5 and bring your attention to this bottom input here, which is the determinator. Now this is where things get interesting with the bilateral blur node. The determinator effectively helps you to locate where edges are in your image based on one of these outputs. For example, we could take this normal output and plug it into the determinator. Have a look at what happens to the image in the background. So allow it to composite, and then you'll be able to see that the blur is still in effect, but with the dodgeball in particular, the edges appear very sharp. If we have a look at the normal output itself by plugging it in directly to our viewer node, then you can see that the variations in color here help to impact how this output affects the bilateral blur. So let's plug this back into the bilateral blur and then plug the image into the image input. And then let's have a look at a few of these other options to see if one of them can give us an even better result. So let's see if alpha does anything. So first of all, just plug the alpha into the viewer to see if we get anything. We don't get anything there. And if you don't see anything that you think might help you with the blur, then it's probably not going to help. If we try the depth, for example, plug that into the image, we get a little bit here, so we get some black and white values. We can test this by plugging it in. Oh, I plugged it into the wrong one there. Hit Control and Z to undo. And then let's plug it into the determinator and then the viewer node. And that, as we can see, does help to sharpen the edges that we could also see when we previewed the depth output itself. Let's see if any of the other outputs can give us some better results. So we have shadow. We have ambient occlusion. Let's plug the ambient occlusion, see what that does. We've tried the normal. Let's try the vector this time, see if that has any impact on our blur. That one in particular doesn't seem to have much of an impact. If we plug it in directly, just to confirm, we actually get no data from this one at all. So it's not going to impact the bilateral blur if it doesn't show up here on its own. And it seems as though the best option for me might actually be to use the depth output. And to help us out a bit, we can come to the bilateral blur node itself and reduce this to a lower value. So let's go 0.1 and press enter. That's going to dramatically reduce the radius of the blur. So now we do have the bilateral blur present, but it's not going to be as strong on the edges of the dodgeball or the cone, thanks to the data that has been supplied by the depth render pass. If we compare the bilateral blur at this point to the regular blur node, then we will be able to see, if I can select the viewer node correctly, that the blur node has its effect evenly distributed across our entire render, whereas the bilateral blur, we are able to determine where the main edges are in our render and minimize the effects of the blur around those edges. The next one that we're going to demonstrate is going to be the glare node. What we're going to do is we're going to take our bilateral blur, our regular blur, and this viewer node, and we're going to delete those three nodes, plug the denoise back into the viewer, and then we get our denoised image. Next, go Shift and A, go down to where it says filter, and this time select glare. We'll plug glare into this connection, let that composite, and wonder why nothing's happening. Well, the reason why nothing's happening is glare, when it's brought into a setup, has a threshold value of 1. Let's zoom in so that we can see our glare node clearly. We have this threshold value and we need to reduce the threshold value in order to get the glare in our scene. Let's take that value and first of all let's set it to 0 so the value is opposite to what it normally is by default. And you can see now that the scene appears to be much brighter. We even get this sort of streak effect where we have the brighter colours. So we have this bright yellow circle in front of the red background that is the rest of the dodgeball, and that contrast is helping to create these visible streaks. It's not as visible elsewhere in the image, but you can see where the colours are brightest. So for example, where our cone is, we almost get this sort of halo effect coming around the cone, and even in other parts of our scene to a lesser extent. If we were to increase this threshold, we would decrease the amount of blur in our scene. And as we hover over the threshold, you can see the descriptor there, which pretty much tells you all you need to know about the threshold. So the glare filter will only be applied to pixels brighter than this value. So if a specific pixel has a numerical value higher than 0.1 in terms of its brightness, then it's going to receive the glare effect. This way you can isolate the glare to the brighter parts of your scene specifically by setting it up to say 0.5, for example. Most of the scene has no glare present, but the very bright colours, so once again the cone as well as the yellow circle on the dodgeball, they still have glare in effect because their values are brighter than 0.5. Above it we have this mix value. Now this mix value is set between -1 and 1. At the moment it's set to 0. If we set this all the way to a value of 1 and allow that to composite, then we end up with the processed effects only. So it says processed image, but we can't actually see our image. What we are looking at instead is the effect based on what our threshold is. If we increase the threshold, then we will begin to reduce what is visible in our scene because the mix value is set to 1. So if I set the threshold to 0.9, for example, we can now only see this red reflection here, which we actually couldn't see before at all. And also if we look down here in the viewer node, the pure white lines, which are the brightest parts of this image, are the only things that are still visible. That means that we'd have to reduce the mix to a value where we can see the rest of our scene, and just by going down to 0.9 we begin to see the scene again because it's not set to 1 anymore. If we set the threshold back up to 1, then that's basically telling Blender to not apply glare to the image. If we set this all the way to 1, then only the white bits which have a value, a brightness value equal to 1 itself, are visible because we have set both the threshold and the mix to 1. I'm going to set this back to 0.5 for the threshold, let that load up, and then you can see everything that is being affected by the glare. Now if I was to reverse this back from 1 to -1, it will apply the opposite, which means there is no glare effect whatsoever in our image. Now, for example, a good way of mixing these two together to get the effect that you want is to find the parts of the image that you want to highlight. So a threshold of 0.5 is a good value because at 1 it allows me to highlight the cone for some glare, but it's obviously too high a value because I still want to see the rest of my scene, which means I'm going to use a value just above 1, so maybe 0.2, and then press enter. And with this, the rest of the image doesn't quite begin to darken just yet, but it is beginning to focus more on the glare. So let's increase that to 0.3. Let's see how that looks. Maybe 0.4. That looks better. So now once we get to 0.4, maybe 0.5, the glare itself becomes much more vibrant compared to the background. But we've spent a lot of time talking about these two values. These are the main two values that I tend to use first off before I look at anything else. So we actually have the type of glare up here. We're currently set to streaks, but we can go to ghosts, for example. Let that composite. And in this case, when we set it to ghosts, it's a very blurry effect. It's almost as if we can see reflections, hence the name ghosts, of the cone. You might be able to see right here, we can see a reflection of the cone. If we change this to fog glow, which I know is many people's favourite, then it creates a fog glow effect. I'm just going to reduce the threshold for this one so that we can get a better look at the glow. And actually that's too far. Let's push that back to 0.4, and actually here setting the threshold value below 0.5 gives us some artifacting in the glare that we're not quite looking for. But again, you can play about with these values, so maybe it's a case of reducing the mix value, for example. Maybe you might get something that looks a bit better, so that actually does look a bit better. Then we can reduce the threshold, see what we get with our fog glow. And I don't know about you, but I can begin to see the effect around our cone in particular. But let's just move on to the last one, which is simple star, which is similar to the streaks option. However, it kind of creates like a star pattern for its glare rather than just regular streaks. Now I'm just going to go back to the streaks option, and you'll notice that we have a few other options here, such as iterations, so we can play about with the iterations. You can go up to a maximum of 5 for this, and that will just increase the overall strength of the glare. You can also here increase the number of streaks, so I can increase it up to a maximum of 16. And if you pay particular attention to this yellow circle here, you can see that there are many more streaks coming out. It actually looks almost like the sun. If you were to squint your eyes at the sun and you see the sun's rays, that's what it kind of begins to look like. Now we could spend more time going through all of these different options and seeing how they work, but I think it's better to just leave you to test out which of these options that you like to use best. So I think we're going to end it there for this video, and in the next video we're going to be using the glare node along with some other filter nodes in order to get some interesting effects with our title image, which will be making a comeback in the next video. So thanks guys, and I hope to see you there. Welcome back to this Blender 2.8 Beginners Compositing course. For this video, we're going to be picking up where we left off in episode 4, and we're going to be using some of the nodes that we have learned up to this point to create this effect for our image. In particular, we're going to be focused on blurring and using the glare node to create this brightening of the center of the image. But that's not all that we're going to be doing. In this lecture, the main focus is going to be on how you can create masks and use those masks in compositing to isolate specific parts of your image. Now, if you want to follow along with this 6-part series using your own projects, you are more than welcome to do so. However, if you are looking to use the project that we are using for this series, then you can download it via the link in the video description. But not only will you be getting all of the assets related to our project, if you sign up, you will also get access to our free Blender 2.8 PDF cheat sheet full of keyboard shortcuts that are commonly used in Blender for things like navigating the 3D viewport, creating animations, manipulating nodes in the compositor, etc., as well as some of our top tips and tricks for making the most of your Blender experience and improving your workflow. On top of that, you will also have access to our bi-weekly newsletter for the latest information on all things related to Blender. The first thing I want to do for this video is bring back our title image. That means we're going to go Shift and A, go to Input, add a new image, position here, and this time if we just zoom in on our image node, we don't have to press the Open Image option because we already have our title image in this project. Instead, we can go to this drop down menu and then we can find our title image, left click, and that brings our image into this node. Up next, we need to add this image node to our tree. I'm just going to, just for the moment, get rid of the glare node itself, and instead I'm going to add in a different node. So go Shift S, and this time I'm actually going to use a mix RGB node. Select mix, then we're going to take the image output and plug it into the image input, and you can see that one image basically overlaps the other, but we can solve this problem very easily by taking the alpha value from our title image and plugging it into the factor value of our mix RGB node. Let that composite, and we end up with a transparent title image on top of our main image. If we were to reverse the positioning of the two images, which means grabbing one input and basically swapping it with the other, the title image becomes the primary image when it comes to the data that this mix RGB node is receiving. However, we can actually see the main image or parts of the main image within the words of our title. For now though, I'm going to reverse these back into their original positions to give us our image with the title in front. Next, I'm going to just zoom out of my background, which I can do by pressing Phi on my keyboard. So I'm going to press Phi a couple of times just to zoom out. And what I want to do to start with is I want to decrease the brightness of the main image, which means we're going to need to bring back one of our color nodes. Now, many of the color nodes will be able to work for us in this situation, but I think the one that I am going to use is going to be a hue saturation value. I'm going to plug this in here because I don't want it to affect the title image. Remember, where you plug nodes in to your node tree can have a significant impact on their effects on the final result. Now I'm going to place my hue saturation value node here, so left click to add it to our setup. Then let's try reducing the value here. So if we reduce that to, say, let's go around 0.65, that begins to lower the brightness value. I think we can go even lower than that, so maybe let's go 0.37. And I believe that's dark enough for the effect that I'm going to be looking for. Now, using something like the glare node to create a glare around the words is going to be pretty difficult in this situation, and the reason why is the title image is effectively just text created in Photoshop on a transparent background. If I demonstrate the glare node with our title image, we're going to go Filter, Glare, and we're going to plug the glare into here. Now, currently the threshold is set to 1, so there is nothing there as we expect. If I set the threshold down all the way to 0, let that composite, it does work, but the effect is very strange. It's almost taking out the saturation from the corners of some of these letters. If we test the mix value here, so increase that to 1, we can see that the behavior is not what it was before when we previously used the glare node on our main image. This means we're going to need to find a different solution. And the solution that I am going to use is by creating a mask that's going to go around our title image. This means that currently we don't need the glare node because it doesn't serve us any purpose. So make sure that the glare node is selected, press X, and then relink the image output with the image input. And now we are going to be creating the mask. Now, in order to create the mask, we're not going to do that in the compositor. Instead, we're actually going to do that here in the image editor. What we're going to do is we're going to change this option here from view, which allows us to view the image, to mask, which allows us to create a mask over our existing image. I'm going to left click. This is an example of a mask that I previously created before beginning the tutorial series, which means I'm going to need to first of all delete this mask. If I come up to the header bar for this panel and scroll down on my mouse, I can pan my options across until I see the name of my mask. In this case, the name of my mask is whiteboard. I'm just going to click on this X button here, and that is going to temporarily get rid of my mask that I created. Now, to add a new mask, we can click on this new button, and that's going to allow us to create this new mask. And we've got an operator panel that we can open up, but we only have the one option here, which is to name our mask, which means I need to name it something that's going to be appropriate. So I'm going to name it as Title Glare. And press enter. And that's the name of our new mask. Now, we haven't created the mask yet. To do that, I'm going to go to the add menu, and I can select either circle or square. Now, you can also create the points of your mask manually, but I don't need to do that if I'm going to create a uniform shape around my title image, which is what I'm planning to do, which means we're just going to be keeping things simple when it comes to creating the mask. Let's go with the square option, and when we add the square, it currently has a set size, which at the moment is 100 pixels, and a set location. So we need to first of all define the size and then define the location. At the moment, you might not be able to see it, but it is just behind the operator panel in the corner of our image, with the values of X and Y both set to 0. That means that the center of our square is set to those points on the image itself. If I was to increase the value on the X axis, and I'm going to need to increase it quite a lot, for example 500, and press enter, eventually you'll start to see it's still behind our operator panel. Let's increase that even further to 1500. And you can see it right there. So it's moved 1500 pixels across the image. But we want it to be positioned probably about here, which means I'm going to take it on the y-axis about halfway up. Now, this is a 1920 by 1080 image. Let's try a value of 540 on the y-axis, which looks pretty much spot on for this situation. Then we'll take the X value and reduce it to maybe 600. That looks perfect. Now we can begin to look at the size of our square, which we're going to make a little bit bigger than what it is. Let's try a value of 150. Maybe a little bit more than that. Let's try 180. And let's move it up a little bit on the y-axis. Maybe a value of 570. Oh, that's too much. At this point, the values get a little bit closer. Okay, so here we've got a square that's in the correct positioning, but we want it to go all the way across our title image. Now you will notice that my operator panel just disappeared, and that's because I ended up pressing the A button to select all of the points on my square. But that's fine because we don't need that operator panel anyway. What we do need is we need to grab these 2 points, which we can do so by holding down the Shift key, and then hit the G key on our keyboard, and this allows us to grab these 2 points and move them across. We can also lock them to a specific axis, so we can lock them to either the X or Y axes. In this case, I am going to lock it to the X axis, move it all the way across, and then left click to confirm. Now we get our move operator panel that has appeared. I'm just going to minimize that. And I think it could actually be brought up a little bit and also brought down a little bit as well. I'm going to select the top 2 points, hit G, then Y, then just move it up ever so slightly to about here. Select the bottom points, hit G, then Y, and move down to about here. We no longer need to do anything with regards to the creation of the mask. Everything's ready to go in that case. Now it's time to add the mask to our node setup. I'm just going to zoom out here just a bit and go Shift A, and we're going to be adding a new input, which is going to be a mask. I'm going to position this node here, and if we just zoom in on the node itself, we have this icon here which can browse the masks that we have created. You will see that I have 3. If you're following along with the lecture, you will most probably have the 1, which is going to be title glare, which is the one we want to select. Now we have selected our title glare as the mask, but how are we going to add it to our... Now the method that I am going to use for bringing in our title glare mask is to actually select the Mix RGB node, hit Shift D to duplicate it, and position the duplicate here. Then I'm going to change the type of operation from mix to overlay. So select overlay from this list. Then we're going to take our mask and plug it into the factor value here. And now we can see both the main image as well as the mask. If we were to change this image color, however, so let's go something like red, then as it is, it's just going to give our mask a paint over based on what color we select. What we want to do here is just get that back to pure white. Let that load up again. And we want to plug something into this image node. if we were to reintroduce our glare node, position it about here, then connect our input to the inputs here. Nothing changes right off the bat, but we already know that's because of the threshold value for the glare, which is set to 1 by default. Let's set that value to 0.2. Let that composite. And we still don't get anything. The reason why is because we need to tell the glare node to use the mask. We can do that by taking the mask output and plugging it into the image input. As soon as we do that, we let it composite and then we get the glare effect. At the moment, the glare looks a little bit bland, and the two reasons why is the glare is mainly equally distributed across the mask, and also I think the square border is a bit too harsh. The first thing I'm going to do in that case is deal with the distribution of the glare by changing the type of glare. I think I'm going to go and just check each of these. So we're on streaks at the moment. Let's select ghosts, preview that. That instantly looks better. We can see that there's a little bit more light in the center of the mask and it fades away as you move out towards the edges. We have fog glow, and we have simple star. Now, of these four options, simple star gives us a little bit more brightness in this case, but I'm going to go with the ghosts effect. I think that's going to look quite suitable, because what I'm going to do next is I am going to add some blur to go around our mask. That means I'm going to need to reposition a couple of nodes. I am going to go Shift A, filter, and which one can we use? Let's just use the normal blur, see how that works to start with. Plug that in here, and then use an X and Y value in the 20s, see how that works. Allow that to composite. And it's looking a little bit better. I think maybe let's try a different type of blur. Maybe we can go Shift S, try bilateral blur instead. See how that looks when we load it up. Maybe change the color spacing. Try reducing that, see if that helps. Perhaps even the color sigma. And try increasing the iterations. It gets to a point where it's basically trial and error to try and get the effect that you are looking for. I'm just looking for a little bit of a feather around the edges of the mask here. And I think the number of iterations is helping to improve that feather just bit by bit. So increasing it to 10. Yeah, we can just begin to see around the edges, the fall off just getting a little bit more noticeable. So I like the look of that glare effect on my image. What we're going to do now is we're going to get a little bit of practice in and create a second mask. But this time we're going to actually create the points for our mask. You will have noticed when I first created, or before I created the mask, that I had already created one previously for the whiteboard. That's what we're going to do now. So zoom in on your whiteboard in the image editor, and in order to create a point for your new mask, you are going to hold Control and then left click. Now, before you do that, the question is, do you want a separate mask or do you want to use your existing mask? If you use your existing mask, you are basically just going to be adding the area of influence that the mask has on your image. Now, I am actually going to add a new mask because I don't want glare on the whiteboard. Instead, what I am aiming to do is I'm basically going to clear the board. So I'm going to make it a single color, which if we have been following along up to this point should be a relatively simple task. Now, before we can do that, we need to make sure that we create a new mask, which we can do by going to add, and it's not there. We can only add to our existing mask. So how are we going to add a new one? Well, if you go back to the title glare and then press on the X button here to unlink the data block, you unlink the data block. However, you can still see the effects of our mask because the mask itself still exists in our project and it's still attached to the title glare node here. So that's not really a problem. And now we can just click on this new button to create a new mask. What I'm going to do is I am going to zoom in once again on our whiteboard here in the background. And now it's going to be a matter of adding some control points. I'm going to hold down Control on my keyboard and left click to create a single point. Then we're going to left click about here. Another one down here. And just being careful about where you position. We don't want too much overlap on the dodgeball. So zoom in as far as you feel comfortable with. If you don't hold down the control key, you can grab these points and begin to reposition them. I'm just going to position these appropriately and then back down with control. We'll have this one down here and reposition. And depending on what you want to do, you will have to spend a little bit more time on constructing masks with custom shapes. I'm going to add another point about here. And it looks like something weird has happened. I'm just going to hit Control and Z. And that's actually because we had a different point selected. We want to select this one at the end, hit Control, and then click. And let's just pan our view. Select this point, hold Shift and select this point, and then to connect them, we're going to use the hotkey Alt and C on our keyboard, and that is going to connect the loop. Now we're just going to make a final readjustment here and also here. And we're getting to the point where we're zooming in so far that you can actually begin to see the pixels of our rendered image. But now I think that mask is suitable for usage. So I am going to name this mask as whiteboard and press enter. Next, we're going to zoom out in our compositor. We're going to hit Shift D to duplicate our overlay node. Position here, and at the moment this overlay node is overlaying this white image color on our entire image, which means we now need to take this mask node, hit Shift D to duplicate, position here, and if we zoom in, we can change this from title glare to whiteboard. Now I actually have two masks of the same name. This is an issue that I've left myself with. I've got to make sure that I pick the right one. I'm going to select the first one and plug it in to the overlay here. And in my case, that was the incorrect one, but that's not a problem. I can just select the second one, let that recomposite. We might need to replug that in. And there we go, so that looks a lot better. We do need to plug the mask value into the factor. And because I'm looking for a white background here, I can actually detach from this node and release. And if we have a look to see how that affects our mask, it doesn't appear to have any impact at the moment. Let's try changing this to mix. Let that load up. And there we go. So now, by reverting this back to the mix type, we are able to effectively create a pure white background for our whiteboard, or indeed any other color that we want. So we can choose a red color, for example. Let that composite. And then the whiteboard now has a red background. I'm going to set it back to white. And the only thing that I'm going to change with our whiteboard is the level of brightness. So we're going to take the brightness and we're just going to make it a bit grey, a bit dirty, to better suit the rest of our scene. So there we go. We've now been able to add 2 masks to our node tree. The last thing we're going to do is we're just going to clear things up a bit by adding some frames. So with this node setup, we need to identify basically the hierarchy, which we're going to use the mix RGB nodes to help us with. So anything that comes before this mix RGB node is going to be a part of 1 frame. Anything that comes before our overlay node here is going to be 1 frame, and anything that's a part of this mix RGB is going to be a part of 1 frame. That means I'm going to first of all take these 4 nodes in our scene and hit Shift and P on my keyboard to create a new frame that is going to contain those 4 nodes. With the frame selected, I'm going to give this one a goldish color and give it the label as title, since it focuses on the title itself. Just move this over here a bit. And next we're going to create a frame for these 4 nodes. So make sure that we select these 4 nodes, hit Shift P to create the frame. This one we're going to give it a very light blue. And the nodes here basically represent the title mask. So we're going to label this frame as title mask. And then finally we have 2 more nodes to finish. We'll move our viewer node over here, take the mix and the whiteboard here, select those 2, hit Shift and P, and name this one as whiteboard mask. Change the color to, let's go with a pinkish color this time. Zoom out, and then we're going to enable snapping, and then just readjust if we can. Let's readjust on the y-axis. You can see it gets very finicky when we are dealing with the frames, so let's use our nodes to help us. And just reposition these accordingly. Bring that to about there. That looks a bit better. And then take the mix RGB. And we just want to try and line up the tops of the frames as best we can. We'll take this one here. And there we go. So congratulations guys on completing this video. And stay tuned because one more video in the YouTube Compositing course for Blender version 2.8 is still to come. Thanks guys, and I'll see you next time. Alright then, so here we are on the final episode of our 6-part compositing series. And for this episode, we're going to switch gears a bit, and instead of using a single image for compositing, we are going to instead be editing an entire animation. And to do this, we're going to need to do a little bit of housework first so that we can set Blender up to successfully render the animation. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take these 3 frames and we're just going to group them as a single node. That means I'm going to box select the 3 frames. You may notice that I have also selected my composite node by mistake. I'm going to hold shift and left click a couple of times so that that is no longer a part of the selection. Then I'm going to press Ctrl and G on my keyboard. That creates the group, and we're going to come straight out of this group. And now we can see our node group, which we are going to rename as second composite. And then I'm just going to detach my composite node from the viewer node and also detach it from our render layer and position it up here. And the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to get rid of this dodgeball.exr. And the reason why we're going to just get rid of this entirely and replace it is because I have found that if we were to create an animation with this still attached to the composite, then what would happen is it would render every frame of our animation, but every frame would be the same as the first. It would basically take the first frame and render it over and over again, which is not what we're going to want, which means we're going to make sure that the node is selected by itself, and I'm just going to press the delete key to get rid of it, then shift and S, add input, render layers, and we'll plug this into our composite node. At the moment it's empty. If we take a look in the viewer node, we will also be able to see that the viewer node is currently empty. But we are not done yet. You will see we have a variety of different render passes. Now we're not going to be using all of these, and I am going to be looking to make 1 or 2 changes before we create our animation. That means going to the view layer properties where we have our render passes. And what I'm going to change here is I am going to no longer require the transmission passes or this emission pass here, but I am going to enable Cryptomat for object, material and asset so that we can demonstrate how Cryptomat works a little bit later on. Now we just have 3 more things to do. The first task of the 3 is to reduce the number of samples. Because we are going to be rendering an animation, the overall render time is going to be substantially longer. And I am actually going to set this down to 10 samples. Now 10 is an extremely low number. However, it's a great opportunity to demonstrate just how good Blender's denoise node really is, even when working with images that have a really low sample count. Then I'm going to go to the output properties, and I'm going to change the output to something slightly different. At the moment we are using the EXR file, and you can see we already have our initial dodgeball.exr here. I don't want to get rid of that, but I also don't want to mix it up with the images that we are about to create for the animation. So I am going to create a new subfolder and name this EXR Animate. Then left click on EXR Animate a couple of times to open the folder and click Accept. Finally, we're going to change the file format from PNG back to OpenEXR Multilayer. We are not going to be selecting any of the movie formats just yet, because we still want to make sure that we can separate the render passes, which we can do with the EXR Multilayer. And now we should be ready to create our animation. So let's go up to where it says render and render our animation. And we can see it's successfully beginning to render each frame. It will do so one by one, which means it is going to take a while. So I will be back very soon. Once the render has finished, in our case frame 80, because that was our end frame for the animation, we can just close this window and take a look at our compositor. What we're going to do here is we are going to detach this render layers node from our composite and viewer nodes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to select it, move it to the side, and let's just mute this node for good measure. Go Shift A, we're going to add a new input, and that input is going to be an image sequence. That brings up our file view, and we're just going to locate our image sequence, which should be under EXR File, and then EXR Animate. And what we want to do is we want to select the first image, scroll down to the bottom, hit Shift and left click the bottom image. That will select all of our images and then import image sequence. Now we're going to position the image sequence node about here. And then we're going to plug this combined output into the composite and then into the viewer. Now the image sequence node displays the number of the frames in the animation that have been rendered. It also displays what frame is currently visible in the background, which is frame 1. But it does not display any of the render passes with the exception of the combined and alpha passes. Now in order to fix that, we simply come down to where it says Layer Composite, and we're going to switch this to View Layer. As soon as we do that, all of our render passes become visible, and our image sequence node gets a lot bigger. Now, if you want to change which frame is viewable in the background and in the viewer node, then you can come down to where the viewer node is and left click on this option here, which displays the current frame. So for example, if I was to change this to frame 40 and press enter, that would update, and now you can see another dodgeball has appeared. One question you might ask is whether or not the frame that is selected has any impact on what goes on in the compositor itself. The answer is no. You simply choose what frame you want to be visible, but whatever we do here is going to affect what is on every single frame. So with that said, I'm going to actually keep it on frame 40, because if we go to frame 1, we won't be able to see that extra dodgeball that's coming in, which is what we see for most of the animation. So I'm actually going to just use 40 for now, and we can see in the compositor that our current image has a very noisy profile. But this isn't at all surprising because we used an extremely low number of samples. In this case, we are going to use once again our denoise node to help get rid of most of the noise in our animation. So hit Shift and A, go to Filter and select Denoise, plug our denoise into here, give it a moment to composite, and it already looks a lot better. However, you may notice two things. Number one, there's still quite a lot of noise underneath the benches. Shadows and reflections are very often culprits for excess noise. And you can also see that we've lost quite a bit of detail in our walls here. Now we're going to get quite a bit of that detail back by plugging in the denoising albedo and denoising normal passes into our denoise node. Let's start with the denoise albedo. Give that a couple of seconds to composite. And then let's take that denoising normal and plug it into the normal node here. Let that composite. And you should see that we've gotten most of the detail in our brick wall back again. So this is what it looks like with the denoise node active, and if I select the denoise node we can preview its effect here by muting and unmuting. So if I press the M key, this is what it looks like without the denoiser, and if I press M again, let that composite, and this is what we get when denoise is in use. And before we move on to how some of these render passes actually work, I'm going to add one more node, and then I'm going to do a test render just to make sure we are successfully able to render out an animation as a movie file with all of the changes made. I'm going to go Shift A, and let's make a change to the overall color. Let's go color balance, plug the color balance in here, and let's just play about with some of these values. It doesn't really matter if it looks too weird. In fact, that's exactly what I'm going for. Increasing the gain here to create a bit of a red atmosphere. Let's really increase the gain so that we get something like that. I'm just looking for a couple of things that are going to be a bit over the top, just so it's easy to differentiate this from the original animation. I think that's a bit too grayed out. Let's actually move that down. Okay, now that we have made a couple of changes to our animation, it's time to save this animation out as a movie file. To do that, make sure you select an appropriate output. If we open up our EXR animate folder, we can see all of these EXR files here. And the file that we're about to create is going to be an MP4, but for the sake of keeping things tidy, I'm actually going to create another new folder called the video folder. And we're going to use this to store our new animation. Left click a couple of times to open up the video folder and click accept. Make sure that it has become the new file output, and then change the file format from OpenEXR multilayer to MPEG video. Then we're going to click here and we're going to make sure that the preset is set to H264 in MP4. And if we just double check that, yep, we've got it in our MP4 container using video codec H.264. And then lastly, we're going to zoom out here and we're going to plug this output into the image input for the composite node. Just let that composite for a second. And now let's go render and render animation. And as we do this, you'll see that it is rendering each frame much faster than what it did before. We can no longer even see the tiling because the data is already there. It already exists for each of these frames. We're effectively just converting this from the EXR images into an actual video format like MP4. But you will also notice as it's rendering that all of the changes that we made in the compositor have also been applied to our new MP4 video. So I'm just going to give that a minute or two to complete all of the frames for our new video. Now Blender has appeared to have completed the conversion of our image sequence into an MP4. What we need to do here is we need to just double check to make sure that everything is in working order. I am going to start by just closing this window and coming to our output folder, and there we can see that we have a new MP4 going from frame 1 to frame 80. But to make absolutely sure that everything is in order, I am going to go into my file browser and open up this movie to see that everything is working right. Here we are, this is our video folder. We can open this up, double left click, and there's our animation after a little bit of compositing. And that sums up the first part of this video, where our focus was mainly on making sure that everything was set up to create an animation. There are quite a few things that can go wrong in this process. For example, if you had any difficulties with the rendering of the animation and converting it to an MP4, normally the most likely reason is because of the render layers node that might be active in your compositor. For example, if we take a look in my compositor, we still have the render layers node, but at this point it's currently muted so that it doesn't have any effect or influence on any of our renders, because at this point we've already created our EXR image sequence, which means the render layers node is no longer of any real use to us for the remainder of this tutorial. Now on to the render passes themselves. I'm going to zoom in on our main image sequence node, and you can see this is such a long list that when I zoom in I can't actually see the rest of the node, but we don't need to worry at the moment about what's down here. The big question, what exactly are these render passes? Well, there is a lot of information that goes into a single rendered image, and to successfully construct that image, Blender in the background divides that image up into a series of properties, also known as render passes. For example, when it comes to the lighting of the render, Blender has passes for the diffuse information, for the glossy information, for the transmission, and also for the subsurface scattering information that might be present in that scene. Bear in mind, Blender is trying to successfully render what is an image of a three-dimensional scene, so there's a lot of data to compile, and in using render passes, Blender is able to divide all of that information up and then combine it together to create the final output. And this is what's normally visible in the combined or image outputs that you would see at the top of the node. In our case here, we have this combined output, which effectively combines many of the different passes directly below it. If we have a look at the render layers node, it's titled as image, but it's effectively the same thing. It's a combination of many of the different render passes below. But that brings the question, what is the point of even enabling these render passes if they are already present here? The reason is one word: control. By enabling these render passes in the View Layers tab, we are able to control them independently from each other. For example, we might want to make changes to the ambient occlusion without it affecting the gloss. And we can do that by organizing and combining some of these render passes together. Now, what you see here is probably the most important aspect of dividing up your render passes. This table here is found in the docs of the Blender manual at blender.org, and when you are looking to recreate the combined result, you should be looking to do so with the help of this table. So at the moment we have up here, we have the diffuse direct and diffuse indirect, and then we have the diffuse color. You'll see that we have a plus and a times symbol, and this actually gives us a very good indication of how we need to construct this in Blender. I'm going to start by focusing purely on the direct passes before adding in the glossy. We're not going to worry about the transmission here or the emission and environment because we haven't enabled those render passes because they're not needed for our example. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to zoom out a bit, and we're just going to take these nodes and we need to move them across because we're going to need plenty of space. And then we need to go Shift A, go to color, and then select mix. We're going to bring our mix node here. Let's zoom in a bit so we can see more clearly. And we're going to change this from mix to add. And what we want to do here is we want to take the diffuse direct, plug it into this image input, then take the diffuse indirect, plug it into this image input. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hit Shift, Control and left click to preview what this gives us. So by adding the diffuse direct pass to the diffuse indirect pass, this is our current result. In order to get a better result, we now need to add diffuse color. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that our node is selected, hit Shift and D, and then plug the duplicate in here. At the moment the image appears to be much brighter, but we're going to solve that issue by plugging the diffuse color into this input. Give that a moment to composite, and you can see it doesn't look quite right, and that's because if we remember the image that we saw earlier, we need to turn this one from add to multiply. So find multiply from the list and left click, and straight away that looks a lot better than it did before. And this is just the beginning of being able to isolate different render passes, and in a few moments we're actually going to create a couple of edits by using these render passes. Now what we want to do here is we want to add some gloss to our image. That means we're going to take these two nodes first of all and hit Shift and D and drag these two duplicates down about here. We're going to plug the glossy direct into here, the glossy indirect into here, and if I just hit Shift, Control, left click to preview, this is what we currently get when we are combining our glossy direct and our glossy indirect passes. If we take our glossy color and plug it into here, and then go Shift, Control, left click, on this occasion it doesn't appear to have made any difference, but it is still an important step, so we've effectively added the two together. But obviously In this case, the glossy color doesn't have the same impact as the diffuse color does. But what we need to do now is we need to combine these two, and we can do so by creating another add node. So let's select this one, hit Shift D, move the add node to, let's plug it over here. We're going to move our glossy render pass to the bottom, plug the diffuse into the top, and now we have successfully been able to reconstruct the image that was created in the combined render pass at the top. If I go Shift, Control, and left click, we're currently on the add node that has all of the information from these other nodes. If we were to just zoom out a bit and preview this node directly, so let's go Shift, Control, left click, you can see that nothing at all has changed in the background, and the reason why is because what we're getting here is exactly the same as what we are getting here. And say if I wanted to do something like edit the ambient occlusion, how would I add it in to this setup? Well, it's a matter of going Shift D on our add node. We can plug it into here. Currently, this really grays out our image. We can do something like maybe plug the ambient occlusion pass into here, but that doesn't look very good. So we need to change the calculation that's being used. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to overlay so that we can overlay the ambient occlusion pass on our animation, and then we can do things like maybe play about with the factor value, which can influence the amount of strength applied by the ambient occlusion pass. Or we could set this back to multiply, and if I set that value back to 1, I actually think the multiply node probably works a little bit better in this case. But that's the great thing about the mix node, is you have all of these different options that you can play about with. There really is no right or wrong at this point. You can go through them, see what effects you like the look of, see what gives you the most control. Some will benefit more than others, but in this case I'm going to have this just set to multiply, and then let's just maybe reduce that factor value to something like 0.56, and if we just mute this just to preview exactly what it's doing, you can see that the ambient occlusion is considerably stronger when this node is applied, but it doesn't affect the information stored in the previous nodes. It's simply taking the ambient occlusion pass and multiplying it to our current setup. Now, before we move any further, we can see that it's starting to get a little bit untidy. So let's select all of these nodes, and then we're just going to create a frame for these nodes. Let's give our new frame a color. Let's give it maybe a yellowish color. Give it a bright yellow color. And then just label this as render passes. Increase the label size. I don't really know why they don't just have the label size at its highest, because anything less than that and you just can't see it. But that makes things a little bit easier. We still have some of these nodes going straight through to the denoise node, which still makes things untidy. But we can deal with that a little bit later on when we can just reroute some of those nodes to make things look a little bit better. Now, the second example that I'm going to demonstrate here with the render passes is how we can actually do something like isolate the diffuse channels from the glossy channels when we are doing color correction. I'm going to show you how I might do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a few of these nodes, going to need to shift select them and just move them across just so I can make a little bit of room. And then we're going to add a node that's going to go in between the add and multiply nodes. And I'm going to make sure that the multiplier node is being previewed by shift control and left clicking. And then I'm going to go Shift A and let's do a bit of color correction. So let's do something like maybe RGB curves. And I'm going to plug the RGB curves in between the diffuse color and the image input. So left click about here. And by default, nothing should change because the RGB curve hasn't done anything to make those changes. But if we now begin to edit this RGB curve, so let's grab a point here, move it down, you can see that it edits our animation in real time. But we are able to do so, we are able to edit the colors of our diffuse channels without impacting the glossy channels. If we go Shift Control left click to preview this entire setup, and then let's begin moving some of the curves about, you can see if you focus in particular on the reflections on the dodgeball, you will be able to see that the RGB curves do not really impact these reflections. So we can really darken the image overall, but the reflections here maintain their brightness because the RGB curves node is only affecting our diffuse channels. Now, one mistake that beginners can make is if they were to take something like an RGB curves node and put it into this setup, they might actually do so differently. So sometimes I've seen situations where they still have the diffuse color plugged directly into the multiply, and then they take the RGB curves or whatever color correction node they're using and plug that into the factor, which is not really how it's supposed to be used. As you can see here, of course, currently we have our multiply node being previewed, and even though we've just plugged the RGB curves into the factor here, it doesn't have any impact on the final result of our animation. And this is something that's actually quite common. I do see this a lot, where if you plug your nodes into the wrong inputs, your setup ends up not working the way that you would expect it to, and you're left scratching your head wondering what you've done wrong. So that's just a tip from me, that in an example like this where you're looking to plug nodes into this setup, these nodes are acting as what you could call pass-throughs. So you can, in this example, take the diffuse color, plug it into the image input here, the RGB curves acts as a pass-through, and you can actually see what's happening in the background. But we can take this RGB curves, plug it into the bottom image, and then unplug the factor, and we get our darkened scene, and we also get the functionality that we had previously lost. So if I just begin to move around this curve, I can make whatever look I want for my animation. But that's pretty much all of the need to know stuff when you are creating these render passes. At this point, I would recommend just playing about with different setups, always making sure that the order of the mix nodes is correct. So always have the add nodes connected to the direct and indirect passes for diffuse, glossy, and if you're using them, transmission and subsurface. Make sure to plug those into these multiply nodes so that you can combine things like the direct and indirect channels with the color, and then you combine them by using an add node, and after that you're free to be able to add whatever channels you want to your setup, such as the ambient occlusion, as well as being able to add additional nodes so long as you make sure they are added correctly into your setup. But we are not done yet, guys. We still have one more topic that we are going to cover, and that is an introduction in how to use the Cryptomatte passes. Now for this, I'm going to keep things really simple, and I'm just going to detach all of our render passes, and I'm just going to move the frame out of view just so we're able to focus on the Cryptomatte passes because they work a little bit differently. I'm going to hit Shift, Control and left click so that we can preview the main image sequence node, and then let's just take our render passes frame. We still have one or two nodes attached here. Let's move this up here. Now to add the Cryptomatte node, go Shift A, go to the Matte menu and select Cryptomatte. We're going to position it here and zoom in on our node. And if we just enlarge our Cryptomatte node, you can see we have 4 inputs. We have an image input, a Crypto 00, Crypto 01, Crypto 02. So what you would do here is you would start by plugging the combined output into the image input. But before I do that, just in case you were wondering, if you wanted to combine this with traditional render passes, it's very easy to do so. You would simply plug it to the end of this setup. So you would take the image output here and plug it into the image input here, and you would be good to go. But we're not going to worry about the render passes, just keep keeping things as simple as possible. We're going to take this combined output, plug it into the image, and then we have 3 options here. We can either use the object data, the material data, or the asset data. Now the accuracy of this can be strongly determined by the quality of the initial image, and we have to bear in mind that our initial image was very noisy. So actually in this example, the Cryptomatte node isn't going to work brilliantly, but it should work well enough. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just previewing the crypto object. So let's plug 00 into 00. You notice that they have the same numbers at the end. So take 01, plug it in here, take 02 and plug it in here. Then hit Shift, Control and left click to preview our Cryptomatte node. And you can see in the image editor here that all we get is a transparent background. Do not worry, that is supposed to happen. Perfectly normal. If we hit Shift, Control, left click again to preview our matte setup, this appears black. Again, exactly what it should be. And then Shift, Control, left click to enter our pick view, and now you can see the scene, but it's in several different colors. So we've got green here, we've got white, and we've got black. We've also got a sort of turquoise color for the bench back here. Now the idea here is to be able to use the add option here. This is an add picker, so it allows us to pick one of these colors, and whatever color we pick, it adds that information into this box, and then the Cryptomatte node can isolate any objects that match that color. In this case though, the information that we have here is very limited. If I left click on the dodgeball, for example, and you see something like this, then it means that Blender has had difficulty isolating the object from the scene. If we go Shift, Control, left click to preview the image, we can see the dodgeball, but we can also see the other dodgeballs, we can see a part of the door, we can see the whiteboard. So the quality of the information isn't that great. But we can always try the material option. So if I just very quickly hit Shift, Control, left click to preview what we can see with the matte, Anything that you pick up in the pick view is added to the map view. So again, we can see the dodgeballs, the whiteboard, etc. And what we want to do is we can either remove it, or we can just left click and hit backspace, which is what I'm going to do in this case. And that gets rid of everything that was selected. And now I'm going to take the material outputs and plug these in, and we'll see if we get something a little bit better to work with. We're going to hit Shift Control left click, and that's looking a little bit better. It's still not perfect, but what we at least have here is an example where the cones are very clearly distinguishable from the rest of the scene. So let's try selecting these cones, and we're going to try and isolate the cones themselves. Hover your color picker over the first cone and left click. And when it's successful, you should see a numerical value like this. Now, if I hit Shift Control left click to go into image view, you can see that we have isolated the cones for our image. If we go Shift Control left click again, you can see that the cones are a part of this matte selection. In this case, if we were to go back to the pick view, and then maybe let's try selecting something else. Let's try adding the wall in the background. Once again, if you see this value, it means it's been unable to successfully distinguish this object from another object. In this situation, I think it can't distinguish the wall from the bench. So if we go Shift Control left click now, we can see both the wall and the benches have been added to our setup. But we've got what we want out of this. We've been able to isolate a specific type of object, in this case the cones. So I'm going to get rid of the wall and the benches from the selection. And now what we can do is we can use the Krypton Matte node to isolate these cones for editing. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to start by adding a mix node. So go to color, mix. I'm going to plug the mix in here. What we're going to do is we're going to take the matte value for the Kryptomatte node, not the image value, but the matte value, and we're going to plug this into the factor here. Then we're going to take the combined output and plug it into the first image input. And let's just go Shift Control left click to preview that. And you can already see the Kryptomatte in effect. So now all of the cones have been given a blank white color. If we left click and change this, let's go to a blue color and let that load up. You can see after a couple of seconds of compositing, the color of the cones change, but the rest of the scene remains the same. So now we can go into a bit more detail, get a bit more control, and start adding some additional nodes to the setup. For example, maybe we could go with a color correction node and do some color correction specifically for the cones. Let's take the image output here and plug it into this image input. But we still need to make sure that this color correction node is using the detail from our initial image sequence node. So let's plug the combined output into the image input. Now we get the detail back in our cone and we can begin adjusting some of these values. And as I adjust these values, you will see that we are able to only adjust the values for our cone while keeping the rest of the scene intact. So here I'm going to increase the saturation, maybe decrease that contrast to maybe 1.4, and then if I want to change the color, I can add another node. So let's go Shift A, color. This time let's go maybe the RGB curves node again. we'll plug it in here, and then we'll just use the curves to maybe change the color, maybe change the contrast a bit. Maybe go into the red channel. So let's get rid of some of the reds. Maybe let's take away some of the green as well. And even let's try and see if we can add some blue to this. At the moment I'm just playing about, see what we can come up with. But maybe if we're looking to perhaps get maybe some blue cones here, let's actually focus on a node that will give us that result very quickly. Let's go hue saturation value, plug it in here, and then let's change this hue value until we can find a nice blue color. Bring that hue up to, let's go about here. And that looks pretty good. So now we have been able to successfully edit a specific part of our image with the help of the Cryptomatte node. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reattach this up to our setup down here. And while I'm at it, I'm actually going to get rid of that RGB curves node. I don't think it's helping our case much in this example. Let's do just a little bit of reorganizing. Let's create a new frame here. So just reorder these, and we're just going to create a Cryptomatte frame by selecting all of these nodes. And then Shift P to create the frame. Let's label the frame as crypto, and then let's give it a white color this time. Increase the label size. Let's move our render passes up here. And then let's attach the image output for our mix node into the image input for the denoise node. And then let's make sure that our color balance here is plugged directly into the viewer. Give that a moment to composite, and there we go. So the last thing that we can do here, the very last thing if you want to, is perhaps create a couple of reroutes. So just as a reminder of how to create a reroute, you can go Shift A, Layout, add a reroute, and let's plug one reroute here. So we'll plug that in here, and then it's just a matter of creating our reroutes so that we can reorganize some of our connections to make things just look a little bit cleaner in our final setup. And once you've done all that and you are happy with your setup, don't forget to save all the hard work that you have done up to this point. And then all that's left is to create the final render of your finished animation. So this time I'm going to go back to the file output, and I'm just going to create another separate file for our finished video because I just want to keep things really neat and tidy. Create a new folder. Label it finished video. And then double left click and click on accept. And then all that's left is to click render animation. And then that should render through the frames very quickly. So we'll come back in just a few moments time. And congratulations, you've been able to successfully create an animation in Blender with the helps of Blender's Compositor. to help make those important changes to your render. That brings our 6-part tutorial series on compositing in Blender to a close. I hope you've enjoyed it and that you are able to walk away with a much better understanding of how compositing works in Blender. Thanks guys, and I will see you next time. Hi guys, this is Joe from the future, and I just wanted to clarify a statement that I made earlier about samples and their impact on the Cryptomatte node. So I thought I would just create this example here of an image that I rendered, not an animation, but just a single image that I rendered with 400 samples. Now bearing in mind that each image of our animation only used 10 samples. I'm just using this to display how important it might be if you were looking to use the Cryptomatte node as a part of your workflow. So here I've got the render layers node and the viewer node. I'm going to add my Cryptomatte node in between. And then I'm going to take my crypto object 00, plug it in here. You might notice that it's in a weird place in the list, but you don't need to worry about that. We also have our crypto objects 2 and crypto objects 4. Now you might notice as well that the numbers are a bit weird here, but just ignore that. As long as you match up, in this case 00 with 00, crypto object 2 is matched up to crypto 1, and crypto object 04 is often matched up to crypto 02. Now if we select our Cryptomatte node, hit shift control and left click, the image and map views are normal. If we go into the pick view, it looks very different to what it did with the animation. And actually we have a lot more information to work with. So for example, if I wanted to select this front dodgeball by itself, I can go add and left click, and I get a numerical value here. So if I go shift control left click, we can see that we have isolated the dodgeball and only the dodgeball. So we have its matte value here, and then we can just add additional objects if we want. So we can select this dodgeball here, maybe select this dodgeball as well. And let's preview that by hitting shift control and left click, and there we go. We can now see that we have been able to isolate these 3 dodgeballs in our image. So there you go, that was just a little bit of clarification from me. The Cryptomatte tool is a fantastic tool. You just have to bear in mind that the data that it can work with is going to depend on the number of samples used in your initial image.